Hello, welcome to the fifth installment of the ADIT International Tax Web Series. I'm Ruth Mason. I'm a professor at the University of Virginia School of Law in the United States. I'm also a member of the ADIT Academic Board. And this morning, I guess it's afternoon for most of you joining, I will do a short presentation for you on the OECD or G20 OECD BEPS project. There's a way that you can ask questions in Slido. You should have that information in your email. So I'll be glad to take questions after a presentation of about 20-25 minutes. Okay, so there's a common view among academics, many but not all, that the BEPS project, the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting project, sometimes called BEPS 1.0 to distinguish it from the current negotiation at the OECD called BEPS 2.0 about what to do about the digital economy. So it's common among academics to say that BEPS 1.0 accomplished nothing. It didn't really do anything. It was a technical project to close gaps. This paper seeks in part to refute that claim, but also to say where BEPS came from, right? How did we get there? And then to make the argument that BEPS did accomplish something. It did lead to meaningful change. And then finally, to briefly describe the current debate over digital tax. Okay, so one thing I should mention is that I wrote this paper pre-COVID and pre-BEPS 2.0, so it doesn't deal with those issues. Okay, so first, where does BEPS come from? There were many factors that over the 20th century intensified corporate tax competition, or competition among states for factors of production, and that facilitated and intensified corporate tax avoidance. These factors include legal fragmentation, right? Each country has its own national tax system, economic liberalization, there was more cross-border trade than ever before, and the obsolescence of the tax treaty permanent establishment requirement, which, as you know, requires physical presence before a host state can tax a non-resident taxpayer. There were unilateral measures to combat corporate tax avoidance, but these were insufficient. In many cases, states undermined their own anti-abuse rules. There's the famous case of the United States check-the-box rules, which poked holes in the US controlled foreign corporation regime. Enforcement of the arm's length standard was spotty, and the standard itself was malleable. So there were many barriers to, so unilateral measures weren't that effective, and then there were barriers to effective cooperation to combat corporate tax avoidance. These included the tax competition, right? Competition not only for real factors of production, but also for paper profits. States had heterogeneous interests. They couldn't agree on what should be done. There were monitoring problems, a general reluctance to cede national tax sovereignty, and a lack of clear ideas about how to close even notorious gaps. Think of debt equity tax arbitrage. There's an inability to grasp the scope of the problem due to gaps in data. Countries didn't really know how much they were losing, if any, to corporate tax avoidance and to profit shifting. Another reason for failure to cooperate was interest group capture. It wasn't in the interest of multinationals to support such cooperation by their headquarters state or any other state. Okay, and then finally, there was a view that tax competition was normatively desirable, right? So competition disciplines government, it lowers taxes, and that this was a good thing. Okay, so what changed? What enabled countries to come together to cooperate to combat corporate tax avoidance? Well, probably the biggest factor was the 2008 financial crisis. Not only did this put governments into austerity such that they were searching for new revenue sources, but as governments passed austerity budgets, voters became increasingly dissatisfied with corporate tax dodging. So at around the same time, you had these really important hearings in both the United States and in the UK, so in the US Senate and the UK Parliament, that investigated multinational companies. And these hearings revealed, corporate tax plans, corporate tax planning that was previously well known to specialists in the area, but not well known in the mainstream. So for example, an Apple executive testified to the US Senate that, that Apple had a special low tax deal with Ireland. The company later retracted that claim, right, but not before it was splashed on the headlines of major newspapers. It was revealed in those same investigations that Apple had subsidiaries that were stateless for tax purposes. They filed full tax returns nowhere on earth. Similar hearings in the UK focused on, for example, Starbucks. And it was revealed that Starbucks paid very little tax despite having extremely large sales in the UK. And some of you may recall, those who live in the UK, that there were boycotts in the street of Starbucks. And so this popular dissatisfaction with corporate tax dodging drove politicians to want to curb corporate tax avoidance and provided the political impetus that previously wasn't there for multilateral cooperation. Okay, there were also a series of leaks. So, for example, there was a leak of a cache of documents from PwC called LuxLeaks that suggested not only that multinationals were engaged in strategic tax planning, which was no surprise, but that countries seem to be colluding with multinational taxpayers, in this case, Luxembourg, to help lower companies' taxes and to help companies avoid taxes in other states. So all of this led to what Manal Corwin, the former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Tax Affairs in the Treasury Department, called the mainstreaming of international tax. So before, politicians and voters were ignoring international tax, and suddenly everybody was paying attention. So that set the groundwork for the BEPS project. There were also, at the same time that the political conditions were ripe for BEPS, there were certain institutional changes that facilitated the project. So first, the G20 became a meeting of political leaders during the financial crisis. So it used to be a meeting of finance ministers and central bankers, and now you had political leaders. And the G20 strongly backed the OECD, the BEPS project. Second was the growth in the power of the EU, particularly the EU Commission relative to the member states in tax. The importance of the EU, or the EU is important, I think, because it allows the states to pool their sovereignty so they can act as a bloc. It streamlines implementation of BEPS action items, of the proposals that were part of the reform. And it allows issue linkage so that states could trade off for tax issues against other issues that were important in the EU. The other thing that the presence of the EU did was allow access to the EU legislative process, and many of the BEPS reforms ultimately were passed as EU directives that could bind the member states. And then finally, this is perhaps an American point of view, but we can also see the European Commission as kind of a wild card in the tax policy space. So the Commission could go it alone. The Commission could open state aid investigations, or it could propose a digital services tax, and that these things could happen outside the normal OECD process. And so in part, perhaps to forestall the entry of the Commission, or the further establishment of the Commission as a major policy actor in international tax, the countries maybe thought that agreeing to reforms as part of the BEPS project could sideline the Commission. Okay. Good. So likewise, the experience of the OECD and G20 member states with prior OECD transparency initiatives, such as CRS, the Common Reporting Standard, could suggested to the states that the OECD could be a successful place to negotiate reforms. So the OECD and the G states and the G20 states charged the OECD with reforming international tax to curb corporate tax avoidance. Okay, so I'm not going to go through the BEPS changes. Many people have done that very well. They're useful. If you want to see those articles, which I recommend, you can look in my paper for my recommendations as to what you should read about the basics of the BEPS project. So instead of describing BEPS, here I want to just counter that argument that BEPS didn't do anything. So I want to try and take a big picture view of what BEPS did. And so I argue that BEPS changed the participants' agenda, institutions, and norms of international tax, as well as its legal instruments. Okay, so first, new participants. The BEPS project opened the OECD to the G20. This is a very important development. It brings in states like China and India into international tax policy making. To a lesser extent, the OECD opens more broadly to what's called the inclusive framework, which is now an organization of over 100 countries dedicated to implementing the BEPS reforms. BEPS also held, or the OECD also held, a number of public commentary opportunities. So you can think of in the United States, we would liken this to notice and comment and administrative lawmaking. You know, that doesn't give NGOs or civil society a direct stake or direct say in what the OECD was doing, but it did give them an opportunity to comment. And you know, the BEPS project inspired the development of NGOs such as the BEPS monitoring group. Okay, so new participants. Second is what I call a new role for multilateralism in tax. So, you know, the OECD countries have always made recommendations through the model treaty, and they've written the transfer pricing guidelines and maintained the commentary. But now you have something different, you know, different kinds of recommendations, including recommendations for domestic law, which is new for the OECD. BEPS seems to solidify the OECD as the premier forum for international tax policy making. You know, there are long-standing calls for such policy making to be done at the UN, which is a more inclusive organization, but the success of BEPS made the OECD the most logical choice for BEPS 2.0, which is the current negotiation over the digital tax. So it seems to solidify the power of the OECD in this area. The example I give in the paper is that the OECD Secretariat put out under its own name, that is not under the names of the countries as it usually does, member states, a uniform approach proposal to answer the allocation question for digital tax. Now, that the OECD put this out under its own name indicates that the proposal was highly controversial and the states didn't want to put their own names on it, but it also suggests the growing power of the OECD. Okay, so third is acceptance of what I in the paper call full tax as a norm. So full tax is the idea that all of a corporation's income should be subject to tax where its productive factors lie. It's equivalent to terms that are familiar to you, all of which are pretty awkward, like prevention of profit shifting or prevention of double non-taxation. You can think of full taxation as being one half of Rivenaviona's single tax principle, right? So the single tax principle has two sub principles, right? No double tax and at least one tax. So no double tax and full tax. If you have them at the same time, then you get single tax. Okay, so we're going to talk more about single tax later, but for now, I just want to observe that you can see the single tax norm, the acceptance of the single tax norm all over BEPS. It's in the minimum standards, including in the transparency measures, such as country by country reporting and rulings exchange. It's in the anti-abuse rules added to the double tax treaties and to the preamble of the treaty. It's in the standards for harmful tax practices that require substance. But you also find it in non-minimum standards in various, what I call fiscal failsafe measures, including the anti-hybrid rules and the CFC best practices. Okay, so my fourth point is that BEPS led to novel legal forms, including what I call fiscal failsafes. Okay, so what's a fiscal failsafe? So, looking at these BEPS actions and just in international tax policy over the last few years, it seems like we're moving more towards a norm of not just double non-tax, but also of full tax, the idea that all the corporation's income should be taxed. And so we have adoption of various rules that essentially take the form, if you don't tax other state, I will tax. And so, I looked up some engineering terms, robustness, what's the right way to describe this rule? And that's how I came upon on failsafe. So failsafe in engineering is a mechanical device that engages when so for example, your first safety brake doesn't work, the elevator doesn't plunge, instead a secondary failsafe engages. Okay, so fiscal failsafe is the idea if one state doesn't tax, another state's going to step in and fill the void. The characteristics of a fiscal failsafe are as follows. So first, the tax treatment in one state is linked to the tax treatment in the other state. That's the if part. If you don't tax, I will. Second, the failsafe specifies the conditions that trigger the tax in the second state, the state that's soaking up, right, the tax authority. Third, it specifies the tax treatment. And what's important here is that the tax treatment is a deviation from the state's normal rules. Normally it wouldn't tax, but because the trigger was triggered, the second state will tax. And then last, the overall goal is normative. It's for full taxation or anti-abuse. So just to give a concrete example, the anti-hybrid rules that recommended as part of the BEPS project, they say there's a linking of the two states, tax in the two states. So tax in the receiving state of a payment on capital is linked to the tax in the paying state. So did the paying state allow a deduction? If the answer to that is yes, then there will be no exclusion of that amount in the receiving state, notwithstanding its domestic law might see that as equity that otherwise would be entitled to a participation exemption. Okay, so there's a deviation from domestic law, and the overall outcome, right, is single tax of this hybrid, something that's debt abroad and equity here. Okay. So fiscal failsafes already existed. The term is new, but the concept is not. There were many unilateral fiscal failsafes. Worldwide tax is a fiscal failsafe. CFC regimes are a fiscal failsafe. They are subject to tax rules. What's different about BEPS is that BEPS coordinates and disseminates them, right? So multiple states signing on to enact the same fiscal failsafe at the same time, making them more effective. The coordination of fiscal failsafes helps make them more effective. So in the paper, I distinguish between high tax states that would like to defeat hybrids, but can't agree on how to define the debt equity distinction. So that's one set of states. And then there's another set of states, which are the states trying to facilitate international tax arbitrage, the Luxembourgs of the world. And these states have no motivation to agree as to a definition. So the anti-hybrid rules allow the first set of states to cut out the second set of states. And the anti-hybrid rules allow this to happen without any state having to agree as to what debt is, what equity is. So they just agree on a mechanism to remove the gap. Okay, so fiscal fail-safes are good, can be used to defeat defection by havens, but also defection by the United States. And there's an example in the paper about country-by-country reporting and how this was, US resistance was handled through an administrative fail-safe. Okay, so other novel legal forms arising from BEPS fall into the category of what I would call coordinated unilateralism. The countries got together and they made recommendations for domestic law. They didn't enter into treaties, but they agreed that they would separately adopt similar rules, such as interest deductibility, the anti-hybrid rules, CFC rules, and so on. So the idea was to cooperate while at the same time minimizing delegation to multilateral bodies. And this kind of coordination can be more effective than using unilateral anti-abuse rules. The other novel legal form here, which is truly novel, is the multilateral instrument. This is a multilateral treaty designed to update bilateral treaties. This is, as far as I know, a form of law unique to BEPS. And then finally, the greater use of peer review. So use of peer review is not new to international law or even international tax, but now it's part of a larger movement to use peer review and transnational networks to enforce multilateral standards. So states' adherence to the BEPS minimum standards will be monitored through peer review. Okay, and then finally, my fifth argument for the idea that BEPS represents a fundamental change is that BEPS really heated up a dispute over revenues. What happened in BEPS, what the country set out to do is what they said that they would do, which is close gaps in the tax system without fundamentally rethinking how revenues were allocated across states. That's what they said they'd do, and that's what they did. The problem is that it's really hard to close the gaps while just sweeping under the rug and setting aside the questions about which country gets to tax. So states were dissatisfied, it turns out, not just with corporate tax dodging, but with the revenue split and the obsolescence of the permanent establishment requirement, this idea that a non-resident company has to have a physical presence in your jurisdiction before you can tax it. So the BEPS project provides a forum for airing these grievances and points to the OECD as a logical potential locus for resolving them. And that's how we get to BEPS 2.0. So in my view, one of the most important things that BEPS 1.0 does is lead into BEPS 2.0. So just stepping back, right? So individually, the BEPS deliverables, the individual recommendations made by the BEPS countries may not look transformative, although in my view, some of them are pretty impressive all on their own, like country by country reporting. But in the aggregate, the impact of BEPS is significant. Okay, so, how do we evaluate BEPS? I think the right baseline for evaluation has to be what came before, not what academics might have hoped to see. And here I think what's relevant is revenue. We don't know the revenue impact of BEPS yet. It's too early to tell, but since all the recommendations were meant to raise revenue, presumably they will, but we don't know yet. Inclusivity, here I think the most important change is the addition of the G20. We don't yet know how important and how lasting and how meaningful will be the participation by the non-OECD, non-G20 countries that are members of the inclusive framework. On accountability, here, this is an issue of international law. When you use international law instead of domestic law, you lose democratic accountability. That's how international law works. So there is a democratic loss when you use transnational networks and organizations to make policy. This is especially problematic in the European Union, where the BEPS action items were adopted through EU directives, which have no meaningful participation by voters at all. So the directives are passed by the EU Council, which is the foreign minister or the finance minister of various member states. Okay, and then, for an organization that often advocates transparency, we don't know that much about what happens inside the OECD. The deliberations of the body are in secret. Additionally, using international law constrains policy outcomes. It locks countries into certain positions. Using international cooperation is what locked in the permanent establishment requirement, the arm's length standard. That's not to say that that the permanent establishment requirement or arm's length should be repealed, but the entrenchment of rules in international law makes reform more difficult, even when it's rather obvious, as in the case of the PE standard, that the rule doesn't work anymore. Okay. Finally, there's the indeterminism of full taxation as a norm. So BEPS really raises up full tax as a new norm and puts it, a norm equal or nearly equal to the avoidance of double tax. But just like no double tax, the idea of a mandate of full tax is under-specified and conceptually unsatisfying. We don't really know when something is subject to double tax or less than full tax unless we know where it should be taxed. We need to know the base and we need to know the rate. And in order to know those things, we need to have a distributive rule. We need to know where that income is allocated. So in the absence of clear distributive rules, a full tax norm can lead to double tax in exactly the same way that a norm of no double tax that lacks a distributive rule can lead to non-taxation. So full tax may lead to more than one state trying to fill the tax vacuum, right? Just like the norm of no double tax can lead more than one state to recede because it fears double tax, and that may create a gap. Okay, so we see concerns about the idea of the full tax norm leading to double tax and concerns the United States expressed about country by country reporting. Would countries take those reports and just use them to tax in a way that would be contrary to the agreed arm's length standard? We also see the norm of full tax leading to double tax results, or at least nonsensical results in the EU state aid investigations. So, the outcome of the Apple case, in the Commission's decision, was that the Commission said that Ireland gets to tax half of Apple's worldwide income. That gets the full tax result, but there's a disconnect there. Why should Ireland, of all countries, be taxing Apple? So you get the result you want, but the reasoning, the distribution doesn't seem to be right, and that could be part of what led the General Court to annul the decision. Okay, so to fix this, we need clear, agreed distributive rules. That's BEPS 2.0. But BEPS 2.0 only takes on part of the problem. And, in order to resolve this allocation problem, countries need to resolve the distributive dispute. The problem is that countries don't agree about what makes sense from an efficiency standard. There are lots of different margins you could try to optimize here. Some of them are conflicting. Countries don't have shared standards or shared views as to what constitutes distributive justice. And this has always been true. Countries have never agreed on these things. So what I argue in the paper is that national self-interest is going to be decisive, not exclusive, but decisive in the BEPS 2.0 negotiations. So if we're talking about bargaining over self-interests, then the question becomes, well, what do states want? I think the United States wants the status quo. It's a large winner from the prior paradigm. And then everyone else wants a bigger slice of the pie. They want more revenue allocated to them. So what you have is a zero-sum or nearly zero-sum game. There could be some surplus that arises from legal certainty and avoidance of double tax and trade disputes. But countries really just have to bargain over the same pie. Okay, so this leads to what I call this phenomenon of the United States and the EU as frenemies. So US law facilitated foreign tax dodging for decades. And the rise of digital companies, most of the largest ones are headquartered in the United States. And this has meant that Western European countries increasingly feel the sting of being source states, unable to tax US companies that can avoid the physical presence, permanent establishment nexus requirement, so that the Western European countries can't tax them. And so this frustration comes out in unilateral measures. It comes out in state aid, it comes out in the diverted profits tax, you see it in the digital tax. All of these unilateral responses reflect dissatisfaction with the split, with the revenue split. And then now we see the US response, trade investigations, and potentially retaliatory tariffs. So, it remains to be seen how this dispute will be resolved. This is what's being negotiated right now at the OECD. But I, for one, am looking forward to seeing what happens. Okay, so if you have questions for me, I'll be very glad to take them. You should submit them on Slido, and I will see them. And you should have that URL in your email. So I don't see any questions. I don't know if I'm missing them. So, I mean, maybe the place. So I end the paper with this sort of, well, let's see what's going to happen in BEPS 2.0. But I could take it a little bit beyond that and say, talk a little more about this, U.S. and Europe as tax frenemies, right? So, the first salvo in this dispute. You might trace it back to the state aid investigations and say that was the first point at which the EU targeted U.S. digital companies in a way that the United States really took note of, and that the political branches really took note of. So there was a bipartisan letter that came from the Senate to the Commission for Competition, accusing the Commission for Competition of discriminating against U.S. companies. But the Senate was not the only part of government that got involved here. You also had involvement of the executive branch. So the Treasury Department did its own 25-page white paper, a study of state aid doctrine, and concluded that the commission had failed to follow its own rules, right, in the investigation of the U.S. companies. So the state aid investigations very quickly became a sharp point of disagreement between the United States and Europe. And then not too long after that, you had the Commission proposal for a digital services tax. And then the features of the digital services tax were such that particularly the high triggering threshold for the tax. So you wouldn't be subject to the tax unless you had $750 million of revenue. And then the narrow bands of income to which it applied, and the carve-outs for companies. So for example, digital ad sales were taxable, but digital subscriptions were not taxable. So Netflix wouldn't be taxed, but neither would Spotify. And so this sort of seemingly unreasonable or anyway, not clearly motivated exclusions of the tax, carved-ins and carve-outs, seemed to suggest that the commission was targeting U.S. companies and trying to avoid taxing European countries. And that proposal failed, but France and some other countries, including the UK, passed their own versions, and the U.S. Trade representative ultimately investigated the French digital services tax as a potential trade violation and found that it was intentionally discriminatory. And I must say, it was not at all difficult for the trade representative to find evidence of discriminatory intent in those rules. Merely examining the Twitter account of the finance minister was productive of many items of evidence of discriminatory intent against U.S. companies. So that digital tax is still in the books, and so is the UK one, and we'll see what happens with those taxes. So I see some questions have started to come in. But just one more point on the digital tax. So now the threat of digital tax and then trade tariffs in response, right? This is something that the country, it would be important for the countries to avoid this. And the avoidance of a trade war provides impetus to cooperate on BEPS 2.0. Okay, so why do I think Europeans and others are not satisfied with VAT on digital services transactions? This is this falls right on what I was just mentioning, right? The Europeans really want a share of the income tax. The way they see it is that these multinational companies, Facebook, Twitter, Amazon, Google, they make huge profits. They are deeply engaged in the economic life of France, of the UK, and that deep economic engagement and the contributions that French and British users make entitle the countries to tax a share of not just the consumption, which often there is no in-state consumption except of the maybe of the ads, right? There's no tax on the user. But these states see themselves as entitled to tax a share of the income. It's not enough. And the reason they can't is the permanent establishment requirement, which was formulated in the 1920s for a bricks and mortar economy. At the time, the permanent establishment requirement, that physical presence requirement, was put into the treaty. It made sense. The architects of that treaty did not imagine a world in which you could have the kinds of profits from a state that you now can, while having no physical presence there. And so it seems, we heard from the OECD this week that there is broad agreement on the idea that the nexus has to change. It's not fit for the modern economy. And then the question is, in what ways will it change, and how will that shift the revenue, right? So at the end of the day, the countries are negotiating over a shared pot. How much, if the fiscal presence rule is too strict, too stingy to source states, what will replace it? And how much income will be allocated there? Okay. Another question. Regarding the substantial activities mentioned, does this requirement fit into the new world of globalization, to the digitalization, sourcing out different functions across the borders? Or is it rather an approach to save old-fashioned industries and an old-fashioned understanding of doing business? So the substantial activities, I think that requirement is meant to do two things. One, it's an administrative necessity, right? So you can't tax the first sale, you can't tax the first entry or the first user of a social media network. That can't subject the non-resident social media platform to tax in the user state, because to do so would be inadministrable, and really, might even violate, notions in the U.S., might violate notions of fundamental fairness, right? So that you can't be taxed just on your, no matter how small your availment of a market. Your availment has to be purposeful, and it should rise above a certain de minimis amount. But there is a broad agreement to move away from the old paradigm. But there's not agreement as to what should take the place. It won't be physical, but will it be a threshold number of sales, for example? We don't know yet what the new nexus will be. I can tell you that in the United States, we recently had a Supreme Court case we had a very similar issue, not exactly the same, in the United States, where you would have a company that was resident in, so, I'm here in Virginia. So say you had a company resident in Delaware that was selling into Virginia. Let's call it Amazon. If Amazon had no physical presence in Virginia, then the state of Virginia could not force Amazon to collect the sales tax, the U.S. equivalent of VAT, the consumer endpoint tax, the retail sales tax on me. Now, I owed the tax anyway. There's a use tax that I was supposed to pay, but I would never pay it. Neither did anyone else, right? So it was really important for states to be able to use the out-of-state sellers as a withholding agent for the tax, and that they could remit that tax to the state. But we had a decision, a 50-year-old decision that was again reaffirmed 25 years ago. Both these cases said that a state could not require a non-resident seller with no physical presence in the state to collect the sales tax. And that decision was just overturned in a case called Wayfair in the last couple of years. And the standard that the Supreme Court approved in Wayfair was one based on sales. So you had to have 200 sales in the state, or I believe it was $100,000 worth of sales. And if you met that nexus, met that threshold, and there were other features of the case that were important, including that the state had essentially harmonized its taxes with that of other states so that it would not be overly complicated for the out-of-state seller to comply with the sales collection obligation. But that nexus was approved by the US Supreme Court. And I think many in Europe have taken inspiration from that case and said that, that's a reasonable standard, and that would be a way forward. Maybe you wouldn't use exactly that standard, but that's a path forward for changing the nexus. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. And if you're interested in the paper, the link to the paper, it's not behind a paywall, is in your email. Thank you very much.